I watched a man in an expensive suit break down over a tomato plant, not over a diagnosis, not over losing someone he loved, over a tomato. He stood there in our little community garden with his polished shoes sinking into the damp spring soil, staring at a vine that refused to grow straight. His phone buzzed 3 times before he finally silenced it. Then he covered his face with both hands and whispered something I almost couldn't hear. "I don't know how to stop." Those 6 words stayed with me far longer than they stayed with him. He left after 10 minutes. I never saw him again. But I still think about him every time I water that same row of tomatoes. Because 40 years earlier, I could have become him. Everyone expected that I would. If life had taken just one different turn, I probably would have been wearing the same tailored suits, carrying the same leather briefcase, answering the same endless calls that always seemed more urgent than the people waiting at home. Instead, I spent most of my working life putting books back on shelves, and somehow, people still tell me I wasted my potential. Maybe they're right. Or maybe they're measuring the wrong thing. I suppose you'll decide that for yourself by the time I'm finished. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I'm 79 years old. These days I spend 3 mornings a week taking care of a community garden behind our public library. It isn't much to look at. A few raised beds, a crooked wooden fence that never quite stands upright after winter storms, a rusty watering can someone keeps promising to replace. Children pull carrots that are too small. Retired couples argue over cucumbers. Teenagers wander through only because it's quieter than home. It's my favorite place in the world. Sometimes I sit on the old green bench near the herbs and watch strangers talk to each other as if they've known one another forever. Funny what growing tomatoes can do. Most people who meet me now assume I've always lived this simple little life. They see an old woman with dirt beneath her fingernails, sensible shoes, and a cardigan that has survived at least 15 autumns. They imagine I never wanted anything bigger. They couldn't be more wrong. There was a time when everyone was convinced I'd become someone important. At least important in the way our world usually defines the word. My father certainly believed it. He was a respected physician in Boston. The kind of doctor patients waited months to see. People would stop him at restaurants just to shake his hand. He loved medicine. He loved excellence even more. Growing up, I understood something long before anyone ever said it aloud. Love was always there in our house. Approval had to be earned. When I came home with perfect grades, my father smiled. When I won science competitions, he smiled wider. When I announced I'd been accepted into one of the country's best medical schools, I thought his face might actually burst with pride. That evening, my mother cooked my favorite dinner. My father opened the expensive bottle of wine he'd been saving. Friends came over. Neighbors congratulated us. Someone actually raised a toast to Dr. Eleanor Brooks. I remember laughing because the title sounded so strange attached to my name. It also sounded inevitable. For months, every conversation seemed to begin with my future. What specialty are you considering? Have you thought about surgery? With your grades, you'll be chief of staff someday. It was remarkable. People kept describing a woman I hadn't even met yet, and every time they did, I smiled. Because smiling was easier than admitting I wasn't entirely sure she existed. Orientation day arrived at the end of August. The campus looked exactly like the brochures promised. Stone buildings covered in ivy, wide brick walkways. Students carrying fresh notebooks and impossible expectations. My father insisted on driving me himself. He wore his nicest jacket, not because anyone asked him to, because he wanted everyone else to know he'd raised someone worthy of being there. As we unloaded my suitcase, he rested one hand on my shoulder. "You belong here," he said. I believed he meant every word. I just wasn't certain he was talking about me. Inside the auditorium, hundreds of new students filled polished wooden seats. The dean welcomed us with stories about honor, excellence, sacrifice, and responsibility. People applauded. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. Everything appeared exactly as it should. Then I started looking around, not at the stage, at the students. One young man beside me kept rubbing his palms against his pants. Across the aisle, a woman whispered anatomy terms under her breath, as though she'd fail if she stopped rehearsing. Someone behind me quietly asked another student what score they'd received on an entrance exam. When the answer came, the conversation ended almost immediately. I noticed shoulders that refused to relax, eyes darting around the room, nervous laughter that wasn't really laughter. Nobody looked excited. They looked afraid. I couldn't explain why that unsettled me so deeply. After all, everyone was beginning something difficult. Maybe nerves were perfectly normal. I tried convincing myself that was all it was. The dean continued speaking. "From today forward," he announced proudly, "you will be surrounded by the brightest minds in the nation." The audience applauded again. For reasons I still can't fully explain, that sentence landed differently inside me. Surrounded, not inspired. Not encouraged. Surrounded. I glanced around once more. No one seemed to be looking out the windows. Outside, sunlight spilled across the old maple trees. Inside, nearly every face remained fixed toward the stage, already calculating futures that hadn't happened yet. The applause faded. A professor stood to explain grading systems, class rankings, residency placements, research opportunities, competitive fellowships. Every accomplishment unlocked another race. Every finish line revealed another one farther away. By the time he reached his third chart, my notebook remained completely blank. Not because I wasn't paying attention, because another question had quietly appeared in my mind. When does this end? I looked at the students around me again. Then I imagined us 10 years later. 20, 30. Would we ever wake up one morning and finally believe we'd done enough? Or would there always be another title, another award, another expectation waiting just beyond reach? A strange heaviness settled into my chest. It wasn't panic. It wasn't fear exactly. It felt more like recognizing a song I'd somehow heard long before. My father had spent decades helping people. But he'd also missed birthdays, canceled vacations, answered emergency calls during Christmas dinner. Even when he sat beside us, part of him always seemed to remain somewhere else. Growing up, I'd accepted that as the price of meaningful work. Sitting in that auditorium, for the first time, I wondered whether it was simply the price of never feeling finished. The orientation paused for coffee. Students immediately began introducing themselves. Conversations drifted through the room. What was your GPA? Did you publish before applying? My advisor thinks cardiology is impossible unless. The words blended together until they sounded less like conversations and more like resumes reading themselves aloud. A cheerful girl with curly brown hair sat beside me, carrying 2 paper cups. "You look overwhelmed," she said, smiling. "I was hoping I hid it better." "You almost did." She handed me one of the coffees. "I'm Natalie. Eleanor." We talked for only 15 minutes. She was kind, funny, quick to laugh. She confessed she'd barely slept all week because she was terrified of falling behind before classes had even started. Then she laughed at herself. "I know it sounds ridiculous." I looked at her. "No," I said quietly. "It sounds exhausting." She nodded. "So, you feel it too?" I wanted to answer. Instead, I stared out the tall window behind her. Students crossed the courtyard carrying bright futures on their shoulders. Somehow, they already looked heavy. And, for the first time in my life, I wasn't wondering whether I could succeed there. I was wondering what succeeding there might eventually cost. I didn't leave that day. Not immediately. That would make for a cleaner story, but life almost never gives us neat endings. I stayed through the afternoon sessions. I collected the welcome packet. I smiled through introductions. I even unpacked my suitcase in the tiny dorm room that smelled faintly of fresh paint and old wood. Then I lay awake most of that night, staring at the cracked ceiling above my bed. The room was quiet, but not really. Doors opened and closed in the hallway. Someone laughed 2 rooms away. Water pipes hummed inside the walls. Every now and then, I heard pages turning as someone nearby started studying before classes had even begun. I remember thinking how strange it was that we hadn't attended a single lecture, and already everyone seemed afraid of falling behind. Around 3 in the morning, I sat up and looked at the acceptance letter resting on my desk. People dream their entire lives about receiving a letter like that. I couldn't stop wondering why it felt so much heavier than a piece of paper should. The next week only made that feeling stronger. Classes hadn't become unbearable. The professors were brilliant. My classmates were intelligent, generous, hardworking people. That wasn't the problem. The problem was invisible. It lived underneath every conversation. Every compliment sounded like another expectation. Every achievement immediately created another mountain to climb. One afternoon after anatomy lab, Natalie and I walked across campus together. She had circles under her eyes. "You okay?" I asked. She laughed softly. "I've had maybe 9 hours of sleep this week." 9? I keep thinking everyone else knows something I don't. "You don't believe that." "I don't," she admitted. "But I can't stop feeling it." She smiled after saying it, almost embarrassed by her own honesty. I wanted to tell her she was enough exactly as she was. Instead, I stayed quiet, because I wasn't sure I believed those words about myself either. That Friday, my father called. "How's my future doctor?" There it was again. Not Eleanor. Future doctor. "It's going well." "You sound tired." "Everyone's tired." He chuckled. "Good. That means you're working." I looked out my dorm window. Students hurried between buildings, carrying backpacks stuffed with textbooks. Nobody walked slowly. Nobody seemed to have time. "Dad." "Yes? Were you happy in medical school?" There was a long pause, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Finally he answered. "It doesn't matter." "It doesn't?" "What matters is becoming the kind of doctor people can trust." I understood what he meant. He wasn't avoiding the question to be cruel. His generation believed happiness was something you earned later, after the hard work, after the sacrifice, after proving yourself. The problem was, every older person I admired kept saying later. I had yet to meet anyone who had actually arrived there. The following Tuesday, I wandered into the campus library after dinner, not to study, just to breathe. The building was almost empty. Rows of books stretched farther than I could see. It was wonderfully quiet. No competition, no applause, no rankings. Just people reading because they wanted to understand something. An elderly librarian noticed me standing there. "You look lost." "I think I am." She smiled as if she'd heard that answer before. "That's allowed." I laughed. "I don't think anyone around here got that memo." She pointed toward an armchair beside a tall window. "Sit." "I should probably study." "You've been saying should ever since you walked in." That stopped me. She continued shelving books without looking at me. "I've learned something after 40 years in libraries." "Oh?" "The people who always know exactly who they're supposed to become usually spend their lives chasing someone else's dream." I stared at her. She shrugged. "Books tell you interesting things." I never even asked her name, but I thought about that conversation every day afterward. The next morning, I skipped breakfast and walked across campus before sunrise. The grounds were almost empty. Mist hung over the lawns. For the first time since arriving, I could actually hear birds instead of conversations. I found myself sitting beneath a huge oak tree near the edge of campus. Students gradually appeared as the morning unfolded. Each one walked quickly, coffee in one hand, notes in the other. No one looked up. No one noticed the light filtering through the leaves. I realized I'd been sitting there for nearly an hour. It was the calmest I'd felt all week, and I hadn't accomplished a single productive thing. That thought should have made me feel guilty. Instead, it made me feel alive. The decision didn't happen all at once. People imagine life-changing moments arriving like lightning. Mine arrived like water wearing down stone. Tiny realization after tiny realization, each one impossible to ignore, until one afternoon I simply knew. I walked into the dean's office carrying a withdrawal form. The woman behind the desk looked genuinely concerned. "Are you having academic difficulties?" "No." "Financial problems?" "No." "Family emergency?" I smiled. "No." She leaned back. "Then why?" I searched for an answer that wouldn't sound ridiculous. Finally, I said, the only true thing I had, "I think I'm building the wrong life." She studied me for several seconds. Then she nodded once. "You'd be surprised how many people realize that." "They leave?" "Very few." "Why not?" "They're afraid they'll disappoint everyone." I looked down at the paper in my hands. "I think I already have." The hardest conversation came 2 days later. My parents drove to campus after I called. My mother cried before she even stepped out of the car. My father didn't raise his voice. I almost wish he had. Anger would have been easier. Instead, he looked at me with quiet disbelief. "I don't understand." "I know." "You've worked toward this since you were a little girl." "I know." "People would give anything for this opportunity." "I know." His eyes searched my face as if trying to find the daughter he'd raised. "Then explain it to me." I tried. I truly did. I told him I couldn't spend my entire life climbing a ladder if I wasn't sure I wanted to reach the roof. I told him I wanted to wake up excited instead of afraid. I told him I wanted time. He listened patiently. When I finished, he sighed. "Time for what?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out, because I didn't know. Not yet. That uncertainty frightened him more than anything I'd said. "You are throwing away certainty," he whispered. Maybe I was. But certainty had begun to feel strangely similar to a cage. I packed my room that evening. The suitcase seemed lighter going home than it had coming. Funny how that works. Word spread quickly. Friends called. Professors reached out. A few begged me to reconsider. Others simply stopped calling altogether. Within weeks, I'd become one of those cautionary stories ambitious families tell around dinner tables. "Remember that brilliant girl? What a shame." I heard versions of that sentence for years. The strange part? The world didn't end. A month later, I answered an advertisement for a library assistant. It paid just enough to cover rent on a tiny apartment. My coworkers weren't famous. Nobody asked about rankings. Nobody cared where I'd gone to school. An elderly man needed help finding poetry. A little girl proudly borrowed her first chapter book. Teenagers hid in the reading corner after difficult days at home. Every evening I locked the front doors, turned off the lights one row at a time, and walked outside feeling peaceful, not triumphant, not extraordinary, just peaceful. People often asked whether I regretted leaving medicine. I never knew how to answer, because regret usually means wishing you'd chosen differently. I didn't. What I struggled with wasn't regret. It was loneliness, not because I'd made the wrong decision, because almost no one understood why I'd made it. And for a long time, I wasn't sure I could explain it to myself either. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, someone walked into the library, whose face I recognized immediately. Natalie. Only she looked nothing like the young woman who had handed me a cup of coffee on orientation day. Natalie stood in the doorway for several seconds before I recognized her. Not because her face had changed. It hadn't. She still had those bright eyes and the same habit of tucking loose curls behind one ear whenever she felt awkward. What had changed was everything around them. Her shoulders curved inward, as though she'd spent years carrying something invisible. There were faint lines around her mouth that no woman in her early 40s should have earned so soon. And when she smiled, it lasted only a heartbeat before disappearing again. Eleanor? I blinked. Natalie. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Then she laughed. I wasn't sure it was really you. I almost said the same thing. She glanced around the library. So, you work here. I do. How long? I smiled, long enough to know which shelves squeak. She laughed again. This time it sounded genuine. I've missed laughing like that. There was something in the way she said it that made me put the stack of returned books back onto the cart. My shift ends in 15 minutes. She looked relieved. I'd love to wait. The little cafe across the street hadn't changed much in years. The coffee was average. The pie was excellent. The owner still greeted everyone like an old friend. Natalie wrapped both hands around her mug without taking a sip. For a while we talked about harmless things. Professors we remembered. People we'd lost touch with. Books. Music. Weather. Neither of us mentioned medical school. Eventually, she looked out the window and said quietly, "You know, I used to be angry with you." I smiled. I assumed so. I thought you quit because you weren't strong enough. She looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. You don't owe me an apology. Oh, I do. She shook her head. I spent years telling myself you made a mistake. She paused. I needed to believe that. Why? Because if you were right. She stopped. Then I spent 20 years running in the wrong direction. Neither of us spoke. Sometimes silence says everything conversation cannot. Finally, she took her first sip of coffee. I became a cardiologist. I heard. You heard? Your father was very proud. She smiled faintly. I'm sure he was. She looked down into her cup. I was too. Another silence. Then, I bought the house. The big one? She nodded. I bought the car. The vacations? Pictures on social media. The awards? 3. The research? Published. You did everything. I did. She looked directly at me. I also missed my son's first piano recital. Her voice didn't tremble. It became quieter. My daughter stopped asking whether I'd be home for dinner. She swallowed. My husband learned to answer questions with, "We'll see if Mom gets called in." Outside, rain tapped gently against the cafe windows. Inside, nobody spoke at our table. Finally, I asked, "Are you happy?" She smiled politely, the kind people wear when the real answer is too complicated. I don't remember. That sentence settled over both of us. Not dramatic, not loud, just unbearably honest. We began meeting every few weeks after that. Sometimes for coffee. Sometimes she'd wander through the library after work. Sometimes she'd simply sit in the reading room doing absolutely nothing. The first few visits, she apologized constantly. I shouldn't be wasting time. I need to answer emails. I have charts waiting. Then she'd reach for her phone, stare at it, put it back into her purse, as though she were practicing letting go. One afternoon I found her standing in front of the gardening section. You thinking about tomatoes? She laughed. I've never grown anything. You should. I'd kill it. Then you'll learn. I don't have time. I smiled. There it is again. What? I don't have time. She looked away. I've been saying that a lot, haven't I? You've been saying it since orientation. She stared at me. I did? You told me you hadn't slept because everyone else might be ahead. She covered her face with one hand. Oh my goodness. I'd forgotten. You were 23. I thought it would get better. Did it? She didn't answer. She didn't need to. That spring, I convinced her to help at the community garden one Saturday morning. She arrived wearing spotless white sneakers. Within 5 minutes, they were covered in mud. She looked horrified. I couldn't stop laughing. I told you not to wear those. I didn't realize dirt was so dirty. She laughed until tears formed in her eyes. Children were planting beans nearby. A retired mechanic argued with an elementary school teacher about peppers. Someone brought homemade lemonade. Nobody asked Natalie what she did for a living. Nobody cared. Around noon, she sat on the grass holding a tiny tomato seedling. You know what's strange? What? No one's competing. I looked around. An 8-year-old proudly showed an 86-year-old woman the worm he'd found. 2 strangers were trying to straighten the crooked fence together. A teenager patiently explained to a little boy why bees mattered. No, I said softly. They're just growing things. She stared at the tiny plant in her hand. I don't remember the last time I spent 3 hours without checking my email. You checked it twice. I did? You smiled less afterward. She sighed. I hate that you're right. Life continued the way life always does, quietly. Seasons changed. The tomatoes came and went. The library replaced old carpeting. Children I'd once helped choose picture books returned years later asking for college applications. Natalie kept practicing small acts of rebellion. She stopped volunteering for every extra committee. She took Sundays off. She planted herbs outside her kitchen window. She attended every one of her daughter's soccer games that season. The first time she skipped a conference to stay home with her family, she confessed she'd felt guilty for days. But, she said with a smile, my daughter asked if I was sick. Why? Because she couldn't believe I was actually home. Neither of us laughed. Some truths don't leave room for laughter. Several years passed before our medical school held a class reunion. I almost threw the invitation away. Natalie called the next morning. You're coming. The Manking 5. I don't think so. You have to. I don't belong there. She laughed. Eleanor, you belong more than anyone. I wasn't convinced, but somehow she talked me into it. The campus looked smaller than I remembered. The trees had grown taller. The buildings hadn't changed. Neither had the language. People still introduced themselves with accomplishments before stories. Department chairs, hospital directors, researchers, authors, award winners. They were kind people, good people, many genuinely happy to reconnect. Yet, as the evening unfolded, I noticed something familiar. Whenever conversations paused, someone filled the silence with another achievement, as though still trying to prove they deserved their seat in the room. Natalie noticed it too. She leaned toward me. We're 50 now. I nodded. Why does everyone still sound like they're interviewing? Before I could answer, a man approached us. Tall, silver-haired, expensive watch, perfect posture. Dr. Collins, Natalie said warmly. He smiled. Eleanor Brooks? I blinked. I'm sorry. We shared biochemistry. Recognition slowly returned. David. He laughed. I've changed. So have I. He had become one of the country's most respected neurosurgeons. People gathered around him naturally. They admired him, respected him. For good reason. He had saved countless lives. After dinner, he asked if we could take a walk across campus. We wandered beneath the same oak trees where I'd once questioned my future. The campus had grown quieter. Students were gone for the evening. David suddenly stopped walking. You know. I envied you. I stared at him. No. Oh, yes. Laughed sadly. The day you left, I thought you all believed I was crazy. We did. He chuckled. But secretly, he looked toward the empty courtyard. I wondered what it must feel like to make one decision entirely for yourself. The breeze carried leaves across the old stone path. I've made thousands of decisions since then, he continued. Life or death decisions. I've held people's brains in my hands. I've spoken at conferences around the world. His voice grew softer, but I honestly can't remember the last decision I made that wasn't expected of me. Those words stayed with me long after the reunion ended, because they confirmed something I'd quietly suspected for years. The greatest prison isn't always built from obligations. Sometimes it's built from expectations. We stop questioning until they become indistinguishable from our own voice. I didn't know it then, but only a few years later, news would begin arriving one phone call at a time, and each call would force me to ask a painful question. How many remarkable lives had been spent earning admiration without ever finding peace? The phone rang on a quiet Tuesday morning. It was early autumn. The library hadn't opened yet. I was arranging a display of classic novels when I heard Natalie's name on the caller ID. I answered with a smile. Did your Basil survive the summer? Silence. Then a voice I didn't recognize. Is this Eleanor Brooks? Yes. My name is Michael. I'm Dr. Natalie's husband. Something inside me tightened. No one calls that way to share good news. Is Natalie all right? He hesitated. Physically, yes. That single pause told me more than the words ever could. He explained that Natalie had collapsed at work not from a heart attack, not from a stroke, but from complete exhaustion. Her body had finally done what her mind refused to do. It simply stopped. The doctors called it severe burnout. Michael called it disappearing. I don't know where my wife went, he said quietly. She's been standing in front of us every day, but somehow she's been gone for years. I visited her 2 days later. She wasn't connected to machines. She wasn't dying. She simply looked empty, the kind of tired that sleep cannot repair. She smiled when she saw me. I finally got a vacation. I pulled a chair beside her bed. You always did have terrible timing. She laughed. For the first time in months, it wasn't forced. After a while, she looked toward the window. You know what scares me? What? I don't miss work. She waited before continuing. I thought I'd panic. You didn't. I just breathed. Another long silence settled between us. Then she whispered something I'll never forget. I spent 27 years saving people's hearts. A tear slipped down her cheek. I forgot to protect my own. There wasn't anything wise to say. Sometimes the greatest kindness is refusing to interrupt someone's truth. So I reached over and held her hand. Natalie never returned to the schedule she'd lived before. She still practiced medicine. She loved caring for patients too much to abandon it completely. But she worked fewer days. She stopped accepting every committee appointment. She declined speaking engagements that once would have thrilled her. People were confused. Some colleagues quietly suggested she was throwing away the peak of her career. Others assumed she'd lost her ambition. They were wrong. She hadn't lost ambition. She'd simply changed its direction. Instead of asking, how much more can I accomplish? She started asking, how much more can I actually live? They're very different questions. Around that same time, news from our old classmates arrived more often than reunion invitations. One retired unexpectedly after bypass surgery. Another quietly admitted he'd been treated for depression for years. A brilliant researcher developed Parkinson's disease only months after receiving the highest award of his career. One marriage after another dissolved. Children grew into strangers. Photographs that once showed perfect families slowly disappeared from holiday cards. None of them were bad people. That part is important. They weren't villains in someone else's story. They were good, decent, compassionate people who had believed the promise all of us had been given. Work hard now, life later. Only later kept moving. just over the next hill. After one more promotion, one more publication, one more mortgage payment, one more responsibility, one more year, until one day, there weren't many years left. Several winters after the reunion, I attended David Collins's retirement ceremony. The auditorium was full. Doctors flew in from across the country. Former patients hugged him. Speeches lasted nearly 2 hours. Every accomplishment was listed, every honor, every breakthrough, every committee, every award. People stood and applauded until their hands hurt. David deserved every bit of it. When the crowd finally began leaving, I found him sitting alone backstage, still wearing his medal. He looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. I sat beside him. "You should be celebrating." He smiled without looking up. "I've been trying." After a while, he asked, "Eleanor." "Yes?" "If someone gave you 30 more years, what would you do?" I laughed. "Exactly what I did this morning." "What was that?" "I watered tomatoes." He smiled. "I knew you'd say something like that." "What about you?" He stared at the medal resting in his hands. Finally, he answered, "I don't know." The words broke my heart. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked success, because after 60 years of extraordinary achievement, no one had ever asked him what he actually wanted to do. He'd become so accustomed to fulfilling expectations that desire itself had become unfamiliar. Before we left, he said quietly, "I'm learning how to be an ordinary man." I squeezed his shoulder. "There are worse things." "No," he smiled. "There probably aren't better ones." These days, my mornings begin almost exactly the same way. I wake without an alarm. I make tea. I open my kitchen window. Some mornings, birds arrive before I finish pouring the second cup. Other mornings, it's only silence. I've grown to appreciate both. 3 days each week, I still walk to the community garden behind the library. Children who once needed help tying their shoes now bring their own children. The old crooked fence is still crooked. We've replaced it 3 different times. Somehow it always leans again. I've decided that's part of its personality. Natalie still visits. Not every week, but often enough. She has dirt under her fingernails now. She laughs more easily. Her grandchildren know she grows the sweetest cherry tomatoes in the neighborhood. Every now and then, someone recognizes her from a medical journal or a conference. They congratulate her. She thanks them politely. Then she goes back to pulling weeds. Years ago, that would have seemed impossible. Now it feels perfectly natural. Every so often, someone asks whether I regret leaving medical school. I still pause before answering. Not because I'm uncertain, because regret isn't really the right word. There are lives I never lived, patients I never met, skills I never learned. Perhaps I would have become an excellent physician. I'll never know. But here's what I do know. I've watched thousands of sunsets without wishing they would end faster. I've shared meals with neighbors whose names mattered more than their job titles. I've listened to children discover the joy of reading. I've planted seeds, knowing someone else might enjoy the flowers after I'm gone. I've had afternoons with absolutely nothing scheduled. Those ordinary moments don't appear on resume. They don't earn awards. Nobody applauds them. Yet somehow, they've become the memories I treasure most. I think about that businessman in the garden from time to time. The one who whispered, "I don't know how to stop." I still don't know his name. Maybe he returned to the life he'd always lived. Maybe he made a change. Maybe the tomato plant was just a tomato plant. Or maybe it became the first honest conversation he'd had with himself in years. I hope it was the second, because I've learned something after nearly 8 decades that no classroom ever taught me. A meaningful life rarely announces itself while you're living it. It doesn't arrive with applause. It doesn't come wrapped in promotions or framed certificates. Most of the time it looks remarkably ordinary. It looks like lingering over coffee, because the conversation matters. It looks like calling your daughter before answering another email. It looks like reading one more chapter simply because you're curious. It looks like growing tomatoes with people who don't care what you do for a living, and perhaps that's why so many of us overlook it. We're busy searching for extraordinary moments while quietly stepping over the ordinary ones that make a life feel whole. If my father could sit beside me today, I think we'd finally understand each other. He truly helped people. I never doubted that. What neither of us understood when I was 23 was that helping others should never require abandoning yourself. The world will always have another ladder for you to climb, another finish line, another title, another reason to postpone the life you hope to enjoy someday. But someday is a remarkably unreliable place to live. All any of us have ever truly owned is today, this morning, this conversation, this breath. So when I finish watering the tomatoes, I usually sit on that old green bench for a little while before going home. Children laugh somewhere beyond the fence. Bees wander from flower to flower without appearing rushed. The afternoon sun settles gently across the garden. And every single time, I find myself thinking the very same quiet thought. For a woman who was told she walked away from the life she was supposed to have, I somehow ended up exactly where I was meant to be.